As you've probably heard by now, ex-Empire actor Jussie Smollett staged a bogus attack on himself by paying two brothers $3,500 by check. He has since gotten fired from the show, Empire on Fox, and his character written out of the last two episodes. Local charges were filed, but the bigger, much heavier possible penalties remain undecided. Watch the interviews with former judge and legal analyst, Judge Andrew Napolitano, and retired NYPD detective Pat Brosnan as they discuss possible restitution to be paid by Jussie Smollett and further federal charges that can be filed against him. Enjoy.
Let's bring in Judge Andrew Napolitano, Fox News senior judicial analyst. Good morning to you, Judge.
Good morning.
What strikes you this morning as we learned he turned himself in, and now we are about to get an update from the police?
A couple of observations. I'm wondering if he really did this, and the evidence points that way, what he told his lawyers, because his lawyers put on the public face of he didn't do it, and the truth is going to come out. If he had been truthful to his lawyers, they had an opportunity to negotiate a deal for him, in my view. A small window of time, about 6 or 7 days ago, during which they could have negotiated, I think, some sort of a guilty plea without incarceration. But now it's gone too far. His persistence in lies, it appears, restated by the lawyers, digging their heels in, causing the Chicago police, you'll probably hear soon how much money they spent on this, spent a fortune in person power and in resources, have closed the window during which he can make a deal. The other interesting issue is there's another prosecution here that may happen. The federal government. If he mailed that threatening letter to himself by using the post office, he engaged in postal fraud. That's 5 to 10 years in jail. That's 3 times what he's facing for filing a false report with the Chicago
That's the more serious matter here to address.
Yes, if the feds want to go there.
So we'll hear from police in a moment. What happens this afternoon?
Well, this afternoon, I think he will plead not guilty and be released either on his own recognizance or with a very small bail. I don't think he's a threat to society. As far as I know, he doesn't have any prior record. They may ask him to surrender his passport just to be sure that he can't leave the country.
So this afternoon is a plea, and it is posting bond.
Correct. If there is bond, I mean, it could be a simple signature, a simple promise to return. Since it's a public person, it's hard for him to go anywhere without anybody knowing.
We do know that he did speak to police several times leading up to this. Most recently, his invites, he didn't show. We know that. But he did speak to police. He also spoke in several interviews. He maintained his story throughout. Can those words be used against him?
Yes, Sandra. This very, very important question you have just asked. Each time he lied is a separate and distinct offense if the prosecutors want to frame it that way. Filing the false report is an offense. Lying to them to back it up, first time he met with them, is a second offense. Lying to them to back it up the second time he met with them. So sometimes they merge those into one charge, but if they really want to get aggressive with him, they will file and get the grand jury to approve several charges against him, which expands his exposure in jail and gives the police more negotiating latitude with his lawyers.
I'm going to get to Daniel Linsky in a moment here, but just characterize this for us, Judge. When you think about the national attention a story like this brought to the case, when you think about the charge of racism that involved all the politics that was thrown into it, does a judge weigh those factors? Given the amount of national
I hope not. It sickened me that the president was drawn into this, that the MAGA stuff was drawn into it, that a lot of people said, look, we're a racist society. This is an example of it, people who jumped the gun.
You said you hope not. I'm asking, does the judge have to consider some of this in the case now?
Under the law, the judge sentences the defendant and the crime and not the events around him. So I don't think the judge will take that into consideration.
Okay. You think about the amount of crime that the city of Chicago faces and the amount of resources that were taken away and poured into this investigation for a month, Judge.
I mean, that's the harm that he caused to the government, and that's a very legitimate argument for them pursuing him aggressively.
Away from a bond hearing for Jussie Smollett, the Empire actor now accused of faking a bias attack, diverting precious police resources while taking attention away from serious crime.
You know, as I look out into the crowd, I just wish that the families of gun violence in this city got this much attention, because that's who really deserves the amount of attention that we're giving to this particular incident.
Guster is a civil and criminal defense attorney and the managing attorney for Guster law firm, and Pat Brosnan is retired NYPD detective and CEO of Brosnan Risk Consultants. Glad to have you both here. Eric, you were with me yesterday, but there's been more details released since then. And I wanted to ask you, just looking back, when did you know, based on your experience, that this was starting to unravel for Smollett?
When Jussie started making better stories, and I've been experienced with people who lie about crimes, and what they do, they start embellishing and they start wanting people to believe him. And quite frankly, when he said that he was a gay Tupac, I knew Jussie was lying. That was the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard, and he dug a ditch for himself, and he left a trail of evidence, which is the worst part of this, Dana. For him, he left a trail of evidence. Who writes a check to pay for a crime? Who writes a check and leaves that evidence for them to find? It's ridiculous.
Pat, we haven't heard your thoughts on this case overall yet. So tell me what you're thinking. I know you wrote one thing to our producer, that this is the ultimate ground ball, and you might not know, I don't know a lot about sports, but I have a feeling that means that was an easy one to catch or to pick up.
Yeah. Good afternoon. I don't want to undermine in any way the extraordinary capability and success and tenacity of the 12 rock stars masquerading as Chicago PD detectives. But the fact is, to parrot to Eric's comment, who writes a check to their co-conspirator? Who uses the phone that's registered in their name to call the co-conspirator over 50 times? And who in God's name hires their personal trainer and co-worker as their co-conspirator? Those are three fundamental rules if you're staging a crime. But Jussie made a couple of big mistakes. And the big one is he has a little bit of amnesia. He thought it was November of '87 with the Tawana Brawley hoax. He didn't realize that today there's cameras, there's rideshare data. Cell phones are nothing but a smoking gun that emits a trail of knowledge and facts and connecting dots that is unbelievably efficient in connecting all the dots in terms of the indictment. This guy's in deep, deep trouble.
But Eric, if you are a criminal that's not very smart, it doesn't mean that that the police should be more lenient on you because you weren't a very good one, right?
No, it doesn't mean that they're going to be more lenient. They need to be hard on him because he was so stupid. Oftentimes when people are planning crimes, and with him being an actor, this really leads to that point, people look at TV and they think about what would make a great crime. This is what I need to do to plan this great crime. And oftentimes they go off of what they think is believable. But when things start unraveling and they start putting more and more icing on the cake, it becomes much more impossible for them to toe the line with the truth. And with what was just said by your other guests, he left a trail of breadcrumbs like he was walking in the forest for them to find, and they were eventually going to find it, especially with the national media attention. He should have known that he would be found out with this story, and shame on him. And
we should say his defense attorneys say that they're going to launch their own investigation and they were going to prove his innocence. So we'll see how that goes. I want you to listen to Eddie Johnson, who's the superintendent, who was talking today about why he asked himself why this would happen at all. Take a listen to this.
Why would anyone, especially an African-American man, use the symbolism of a noose to make false accusations? How could someone look at the hatred and suffering associated with that symbol and see an opportunity to manipulate that symbol to further his own public profile? How can an individual who's been embraced by the city of Chicago turn around and slap everyone in this city in the face by making these false claims?
Eric, I wanted to get your take on that. The police chief is just being very blatant about his disgust with Smollett.
And he should be. He should be disgusted by Smollett using those symbols of hate that have been tarnishing and hurting African Americans for hundreds of years. And what I wanted to say earlier was, well, this goes back to what I said earlier. This was a plan, and he overdid his plan. He didn't just say I got beat up, but someone had a noose and someone had MAGA hats, and they had all this brilliant plan to make it sound great. Instead of him just saying I got beat up in the park, he overdid it, and that probably led the Chicago police to really look deeply into it much more than they actually would have if it was just a normal assault.
Pat, if I could have you listen to Eddie Johnson just one more time talking about what he thinks should be the result of the hearing today and at the ultimate resolution in this issue. Take a listen.
Absolute justice would be an apology to this city that he smeared. admitting what he did, and then be man enough to offer what he should offer up in terms of all the resources that were put into this.
Your thoughts on that, sir?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, the chief is spot on, but that's only partial. That would only be a little bit of it. I think the true justice here, Dana, is what we're going to see is called a federal nightmare. He's going to be moving into the federal twilight zone, where he's going to learn that every single time he lied to the Chicago detectives, to the state attorney, and to the FBI, and in public record, open source, is a separate standing federal felony. He's also going to learn about the Patriot Act and what sending self-mailing white powder with an anonymous and threatening letter translates into a violation of the federal felony of terroristic act. And that's where the time will come in. This little disorderly conduct by the state, you might do a year, 9 months, but we're talking 10, 20 years on the federal side. He's going into the federal nightmare zone. He will be glued to the Department of Justice for the rest of his life.
Let me ask Eric about that. Jonna Spilbor, who was on in the A Block talking about this, said it's oftentimes that people who file false reports, they might get in trouble a little bit, but they ultimately often do not do any jail time at all. Is that likely here?
That's not likely here because one of the issues that this case has is the national attention. And what has been mentioned before, he used the mail, which does put it at a federal question if the federal prosecutors are going to decide whether to charge him or not. Because whenever you use mail to commit any type of fraud and you lie about that offense, then you get into federal court and the federal prosecutor has a choice whether they're going to charge you or not. And federal court is a lot more strict than state court because they have mandatory guidelines and mandatory sentences, and that would make Jussie really a target for serious time.
Pat, when you're a detective, put your that hat back on, did you ever have an instance where you start following something up and you realize that the victim is lying and you have to try to weigh some compassion in case the victim is telling the truth, but when you start to find that out, how quickly should you try to figure out a way to make things right?
Well, great question. The fact is, yes, I have. I've had alleged victims who transitioned into cooperating witnesses and who transitioned into defendants on several matters. And the fact is, I put it up as called red flags. So there's red flags here right from the onset. The biggest flag was the fact that he refused to surrender his phone. Oh. That was number one. Numero uno. Then, of course, the tuna fish sandwich at 2 a.m. in the subway. The only ear witness was his manager. Mm-hmm. Exactly. At the exact same moment that he's on being assaulted, he's on the phone with his manager. Lots of peculiarities, as the superintendent pointed out. But the fact is, this quickly turned, and they gave him every benefit of the doubt. They over and above, but 100 witnesses, 50 subpoenas, and warrants, and all the dots connected. And it was bye-bye to the story. And maybe he should be nominated for an Oscar for Best Performance on Sunday on Good Morning America, right?
We'll leave that to Hollywood to decide, of course. All right, Eric Guster and Pat Brosnan, thanks for your expertise.